It was the first Sunday of November, when Sarah Ellery walked up the rise behind the Methodist church in Cold Fork the way she had walked up it on the first Sunday of every month for 6 years. The morning was cold. The grass on the rise had silvered overnight with the first hard frost of the season. The cottonwoods at the edge of the cemetery had dropped their last leaves into the iron fence. The light was the pale gray of a frontier November before the sun had fully cleared the eastern ridge. She carried a small bunch of dried prairie sage in her gloved hand. She had brought sage every month since the spring of 1869 because Thomas Ellery had liked the smell of it. She knew the path through the small cemetery the way she knew the floorboards of her own kitchen. 12 headstones along the left side of the cemetery, 8 along the right, the Crowley family plot in the back corner, her husband's grave at the eastern edge where the morning light hit first. She knew every name in the cemetery. She had attended the funeral for every one of them. She walked the path slowly the way a woman walks who has come to a place she has come to many times before. She passed the Crowley plot. She passed the small fenced area where the town buried the children from the diphtheria winter 4 years ago. She turned at the eastern edge of the cemetery. She stopped walking. Her husband's grave was where it had always been. The wooden headstone she had paid the carpenter to make 6 years ago. The carved letters of his name, the dates of his birth and his death. The small bench beside the grave that she had asked the carpenter to add because she liked to sit there for an hour on the first Sunday of every month. Beside her husband's grave, 6 feet to the right, was a second grave. The earth was freshly turned. The mound was high. The sides of the mound had not yet been settled by rain or wind. A wooden cross had been planted at the head of the grave. The cross was new. The wood had not yet weathered. The name on the cross was carved in deep, deliberate letters that someone had spent a long time getting right. Sarah Ellery, 1834 to 1875. She stood at the grave for a long moment with the bunch of sage still in her gloved hand. She read the name again. She read the dates again. The date of birth was hers. November 14th, 1834. 3 days from now would have been her 41st birthday. The date of death was today. November 7th, 1875. She had not been in the ground. She was standing in the cold November morning at the edge of a small frontier cemetery, looking at a wooden cross that carried her name and today's date. The cross had been carved by someone who took the time to make the letters delves deep and even. This is the story of Sarah Ellery and the grave that was dug for her in the cemetery beside her husband's 6 years after the funeral she had thought was the worst day of her life. It is the story of a woman who learned in the space of one wooden cross that the man she had buried in the spring of 1869 might not have been the man she had married, that the brother she had been told died as a child had been alive for 30 years, and that the second grave beside her husband's was waiting for her. This is Untold Tales of the Old West. Before we go further into this story, if slow burn Western tales told this way, quietly, honestly, without rushing the parts that matter, are the kind of stories that stay with you. Subscribe so the next one finds you. Drop your city or your country in the comments below. I would love to know how far this story has traveled to reach you. Now back to Sarah Ellery and the wooden cross with her name on it. Sarah did not move for a long moment. The bunch of sage in her gloved hand fell to the frosted grass beside the new grave. She did not bend down to pick it up. She read the cross a third time. The letters were carved approximately 1/4 of an inch deep into the wood. The carver had used a chisel and a mallet rather than a knife. The depth of the cuts and the evenness of the letters told her the cross had taken at least 3 hours of careful work. Whoever had dug this grave had not been in a hurry. Whoever had dug this grave had wanted the cross to look like a real grave marker. Whoever had dug this grave had wanted Sarah Ellery to find it. She looked around the cemetery. The cemetery was empty. The early November light was just beginning to warm the eastern edge of the rise. The church behind her was closed. The Sunday service did not begin for another hour. The dirt road that came up from town was empty. No horse, no wagon, no footprints in the frost except her own. Whoever had dug the grave had finished the work before first light. Whoever had dug the grave was gone. She walked to her husband's grave. She sat down on the bench the carpenter had built for her 6 years ago. She placed her gloved hands flat on her knees. She did not cry. She had not cried about Thomas Ellery in 5 years. The first year had taken all the crying out of her. The 5 years since had been work and chores and the quiet rhythm of a frontier widow running a small homestead alone. She had not expected to ever cry about Thomas Ellery again. She did not cry now, but she sat on the bench for a long time, looking at the wooden cross with her own name carved on it, and she understood that whatever was happening to her this morning was not something she would be able to put away by Sunday supper. She picked up the bunch of sage from the frosted grass. She placed it on her husband's grave, the way she had placed it on his grave every first Sunday of every month for 6 years. She stood up. She walked back down the rise toward town. She did not go to the church service. She rode home before the bell had finished ringing. Sarah Ellery was 36 years old. She had been a widow for 6 years. She had no children. She lived alone on a small homestead 3 miles east of Cold Fork on a quarter section her husband had bought from the Territorial Land Office in 1862. She ran 12 head of cattle, a small kitchen garden, 4 laying hens, and a single milk cow that her husband had named Patience before he died. Patience was 12 years old now and would not give milk for many more winters, but Sarah did not have the heart to sell her. She had not remarried. 2 men in Cold Fork had asked. She had said no to both of them politely, and they had not asked again. She kept her husband's photograph on the small wooden bureau in her bedroom. The photograph had been taken in St. Louis in the autumn of 1860, the year before they had moved to Wyoming. Thomas Ellery had been 32 in the photograph. He had been clean-shaven that day for the photographer. He had a long jaw and dark hair and a small old scar on his left eyebrow from a horse kick when he was a boy. She had looked at the photograph every morning for 15 years. She knew every line of his face the way she knew the lines of her own. She rode home from the cemetery that morning, and she went into her bedroom and she picked up the photograph. She looked at her husband's face. She put the photograph down. She walked to the kitchen. She built the fire up in the wood stove. She set water to boil. She sat down at the kitchen table. She did not know yet what she was going to do, but she knew that whoever had dug that grave was not finished with her. She knew that the date of death carved on the cross was a promise. She did not sleep that night. By Monday morning she had a list. The list was written on a single sheet of paper she had torn from the back of her household ledger. The list had 4 names on it. The first name was the carpenter who had built her husband's headstone 6 years ago. His name was Elias Hadley. He was the only carpenter in Cold Fork. If a new cross had been carved by a craftsman with chisels and the time to do deep work, Elias Hadley would either have made it himself or would know who had. The second name was the sexton who tended the Methodist cemetery. His name was Old Pete Murphy. He was 73 years old and had been the sexton for 31 years. He noticed every shovelful of dirt that moved on the rise behind the church. The third name was Sheriff Caleb Hollander. He had been the sheriff of Cold Fork for 9 years. He had known Thomas Ellery. He had attended the funeral. The fourth name was a name Sarah had not written down for 31 years. The fourth name was William Ellery. William Ellery was her husband's twin brother. He had died in 1844 at the age of 9 of scarlet fever in a farmhouse outside Springfield, Illinois, 3 months before Sarah had met Thomas. Sarah had never seen William Ellery. She had only ever seen one photograph of him, a daguerreotype Thomas had carried in his coat pocket the day he died. The daguerreotype had been buried with Thomas. She wrote the fourth name on the list because she had thought of him in the moment between reading the cross on Sunday morning and walking back to her horse. She did not know why she had thought of him. She only knew that her husband had not spoke his brother's name aloud in 15 years of marriage. Not once. Thomas Ellery had been a man who carried his grief inside him and did not open it to anyone, not even his wife. But on the night before the logging accident that killed him in the spring of 1869, Thomas had spoken in his sleep. Sarah had been lying beside him in the small bedroom. He had said one word in his sleep and then turned over and gone quiet. The word was William. She had not thought of it again for 6 years. She had thought of it on Sunday morning, standing at the grave with her name on it. She rode into Cold Fork on Monday morning, and she found Elias Hadley in his carpentry shop at the back of the lumber yard. Elias was 61 years old. He had thick white hair and forearms scarred from 40 years of plane blades and chisels. He looked up from a piece of oak he was planing when Sarah came in. He set down the plane. Mrs. Ellery. Elias. She did not waste his time. She told him about the cross. She described the depth of the carving. She described the evenness of the letters. Elias listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, "I did not carve that cross, Mrs. Ellery. I have not been asked to carve anything in 3 weeks. The only headstone work I have done since October was a small marker for the Pruitt baby. Could someone in Cold Fork have done the work without you knowing?" "No, ma'am. There is no other carpenter within 40 miles. Whoever carved that cross either carried it in from somewhere else or did the work themselves with their own tools. The depth of the cuts the way you describe them. That is not a man who picked up a chisel for the first time. That is a man who has done this work before." She nodded slowly. She thanked him. She rode to the small house behind the church where old Pete Murphy lived alone. Pete answered the door in his stocking feet with a tin cup of coffee in his hand. He had been the sexton for 31 years. He had known her husband. He had attended her husband's funeral. She asked him about the grave. Pete sat down on the porch step. He set the coffee cup down beside him on the boards. "Mrs. Ellery, I have not dug a grave in the Methodist cemetery since September. The last burial was Henry Crowley's father. I tend the existing graves. I do not dig new ones unless there is a body to put in them. Then who dug the grave beside my husband's? I do not know. I checked the cemetery yesterday afternoon before the sun went down. The earth on the rise was undisturbed. Whoever dug that grave dug it between sundown last night and first light this morning, in the cold and in the dark. How long does it take to dig a grave in November ground? For 1 man, 6 hours. For 2 men, 3. The ground has not yet frozen, but it is not soft either." She nodded again. She thanked him. She rode to the sheriff's office. Caleb Hollander was at his desk when she came in. He was 44 years old, a tall, lean man with sandy hair beginning to silver at the temples. He had been the sheriff of Cold Fork for 9 years. He had been one of the men who had carried Thomas Ellery's body down from the logging camp on the day Thomas died. She told him about the grave. He listened the way Elias had listened, without interrupting. He did not write anything down. When she finished, he leaned back in his chair and was quiet for a long moment. "Mrs. Ellery, who would have reason to do this to you?" "I do not know, Sheriff. I have spent the morning trying to think of one. I do not have an enemy in Cold Fork. I have no debts. I have no land disputes. I have no family living within 500 miles who would care whether I lived or died. No family. None that I know of." The sheriff looked at her steadily for a moment. "Mrs. Ellery, the day your husband died. The day we brought him down from the logging camp. There is something about that day I have wondered about for 6 years and never asked you about. I do not know if it is relevant. I do not know if I should ask now. Ask." He drew a breath. "When we brought your husband's body down, the body was identified by the foreman of the logging crew, a man named Jacob Reese. Jacob Reese had only worked at the camp for 3 weeks. He did not know your husband well. The identification was made on the basis of the body's clothing, the body's height and build, and a small old scar on the left eyebrow from a horse kick. The face of the body was not recognizable because of the way the tree had fallen." She closed her eyes for a moment. She opened them. "You are telling me you are not certain the body was my husband's. I am telling you that the identification was made under conditions that were not as thorough as they should have been. The county coroner was 60 miles away that week. The body could not be held for him. The decision to bury was made by Jacob Reese and the camp foreman together. I signed the burial certificate based on their identification. I had no reason to question it at the time. You have a reason to question it now. I have a reason to wonder. Whoever dug that grave on the rise was not a stranger to your husband's grave. Whoever dug that grave knew exactly where your husband was buried. Whoever dug that grave wanted the second grave beside it for a reason that only makes sense if there is a connection between the two of them." She stood up, slowly. "Sheriff, I have a question I would like you to answer honestly. All right, did my husband have a brother who survived the scarlet fever in 1844? The sheriff was quiet for a long moment. "I do not know, Mrs. Ellery. I never met your husband's family. Your husband was not a man who spoke about his family. But I will tell you this. The man who identified your husband's body in 1869, the foreman, Jacob Reese, left Cold Fork 2 months after the funeral. He went north. I never asked him a single question about what he saw when the tree fell because I had no reason to. Do you know where Jacob Reese went? I know he went to a small town called Bear River, 90 miles north of here. I do not know if he is still there." Sarah Ellery nodded slowly. "Sheriff, I am going to ride to Bear River tomorrow morning." The sheriff looked at her for a long moment. Then he said, "I would like to come with you." She did not answer right away. She had ridden into Cold Fork that morning expecting to find answers in the carpenter's shop and the sexton's house and the sheriff's office. She had not expected the answers to all be the same answer, which was that no one in Cold Fork had dug the grave or carved the cross, which meant someone who was not from Cold Fork had done both things in the dark and in the cold and had left before sunup. Someone who knew exactly where her husband was buried. Someone who knew today's date was 3 days before her birthday. Someone who had taken 3 hours to carve her name deep and even into a wooden cross with chisels and a mallet that he had brought with him from wherever he had ridden from. She did not know yet whether the man waiting for her at the end of this trail was a stranger or a brother who had been thought dead for 31 years. She did not know yet whether she would find him alive when she rode into Bear River. She knew only that she was not going to wait at her homestead for him to come to her on the morning of November 14th, which was the date he had carved on the cross. She looked at the sheriff. "Yes, Sheriff, I would like you to come with me." She rode home that afternoon, and she packed a small leather bag with 3 days of supplies and a clean change of clothes, and her father's old revolver that she had not fired in 11 years, but had kept oiled and loaded in the small wooden box at the foot of her bed. She slept that night in the chair beside the wood stove with the revolver on the table at her elbow. She did not know who would come up the road in the dark. No one came. At first light on Tuesday morning, the sheriff rode up to her front gate. She came out onto the porch with the leather bag in her left hand and the revolver in a small holster at her hip beneath her coat. The sheriff swung down from his horse. "Mrs. Ellery." "Sheriff, Bear River is 90 miles. 3 days hard riding. 2 if we push. We will push." He nodded. She mounted the bay gelding her husband had bought her in 1865. They rode north together out of Cold Fork in the cold November morning, with the frost still sills prairie grass and the eastern ridge just beginning to catch the first pale light of the day. The wooden cross on the rise behind the Methodist church carried her name and a date of death that was 4 days away. Whoever had carved the cross was somewhere on the road ahead of them, or somewhere off the road, or somewhere in Bear River waiting for her, or somewhere watching from a place she could not yet see. She did not know yet which. She knew only that she was riding toward him. This is where we leave them. A small frontier town at the edge of the cold prairie. A widow who has been told for 6 years that she buried her husband, and who now does not know who is in the grave, beside the second grave that carries her name. A sheriff who has carried a quiet question for 6 years about a body he helped bury. A leather bag and a loaded revolver, and a 90-mile ride north, with 3 days of November cold between them, and an answer neither of them is sure they want to find. It is told the way the Old West actually felt. Not loud, not rushed, not dressed up for the cameras, but deep and patient and earned. If this story stayed with you, drop your city or your country in the comments below. I would love to know how far it traveled. Until then, ride safe, partner. This has been Untold Tales of the Old West.